Welcome in, everyone, to Beyond the Beat with 32 Beat Writers. My name is Zach Hajduk, and today I am here with the ever-amazing Matt Harmon. Thanks for joining the show, Matt. You are the creator over at receptionperception.com. You're also a football writer and analyst for Yahoo. You can listen to him, if you don't know this already, over at Yahoo's Fantasy Football Show, as well as, of course, Perception the Show. And if you didn't know, you can read him and subscribe over at receptionperception.com, which I would highly advise you do. If you're looking for him on Twitter, you can find him at Matt Harmon _BYB. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, Zach, I appreciate you for having me, man. I know you know this based on, what you guys are doing, your line of work, the whole thing. It's clip season, baby. Coming out of OTAs, we got routes on air. We got guys running around in shorts. And look, I know that we have to be critical with how much do we place an importance on this. Obviously, you guys do great work. I've said this to you guys privately. You cut through a lot of the noise. You do things the right way in terms of crediting and sourcing and all that stuff. You guys do fantastic work. You guys help us a lot with what should we place importance on. Coming out of OTAs and mini camps and then eventually into training camps and during the regular season. Again, do these clips on Twitter matter? Routes on air, the whole thing. I don't know, but I do know this. It's good to see football things again, even if it's like football adjacent things. It really makes you feel like we're getting closer and closer to the regular season.
Yeah, and especially, we are, and we've got a lot of camps doing OTAs right now, and pretty soon we'll be into training camps. Everything you're talking about, we've had a ton of news recently, and I appreciate the kind words. I'll give credit to the other Zach on our team here, as well as Max and Matt. They're both all doing a killer job over there with the summaries and all the tweeting and everything. And I like to see all of this stuff and get excited about it just as much as everybody else. And then if anybody isn't already aware, you can go over and you can read our summaries on the website. Just as an aside for that, if you use the code podcast down below, you can get 50% off your first month there. But I appreciate that, and I'm just as excited. For anybody who's not super familiar with you, I gave you a little introduction there at the beginning, but the stuff and the work that you do over at receptionperception.com, I know you've been working on that for a while, and you're the guy. I think you hold all of that really close to the vest, and you chart like everything. You do an amazing job, and anybody who doesn't know, you just released Dontavian Wicks, Tank Dell, Puka Nacua, Jaden Reed, Quentin Johnston, a whole lot of other guys over there. I've been digging into them a little bit, and it's been really fun to look at.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is my favorite group, honestly, to put up on the website is the year 2 wide receivers, because it's really the goal of reception perception. There's a lot of different goals of what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to accomplish. But really the biggest thing is isolating wide receiver performance from surrounding variables. And I think you can really only do that through actually watching the film, and for me, recording and charting the data and then presenting it to the people, to the readers and to the consumers. Because again, receiver statistics are so inherently dependent on outside variables. And I think it's crucial for these guys that are early on in their NFL career to try to isolate them from those surrounding variables and sort of categorize them really as like, what type of wide receiver are they? Where do they win? Where are they most successful? And then, how much can we expect from a production angle if those other conditions and circumstances catch up to their play, or can those conditions and circumstances even elevate players that maybe have weaknesses here and there? That's what's so fun about receiver play is so like multi-layered. But this group specifically, again, year 2 wide receivers, we do so much work on the prospects. We talk about them coming into the draft. You're going to learn so much more, and this is why I do an in-season report on the rookies. You're going to learn so much more about these guys just taking in like 4 NFL games. You don't overreact to it, right? There's a long career to go, hopefully, for these players, but you're going to learn so much more about them just in 4 games actually on the field for their real NFL team than you ever will just watching them as prospects.
Yeah, and all your stuff over there, like I said, is really good, and we're going to hopefully get into some of those year 2 guys, like you mentioned, some of the rookies, and then maybe some who've been around for a little while. Part of what prompted me to ask you on the show, and again, thanks for joining us for that. I really appreciate you doing that. Is you were in passing kind of discussing on your show, the Reception Perception, the show with James Coe, by the way. I guess I'll give him that plug there as well.
If we must.
Yeah. But I heard you discussing about like what makes a wide receiver one versus a wide receiver two. Maybe a guy is a wide receiver one for his team, but is he a true NFL wide receiver one? And I figured we should just dig into that a little bit because I think it's helpful for us to understand what type of guys may or may not be impacted by changes in the future. I'm thinking of people, like T. Higgins, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, those type of guys that maybe we would have categorized in a wide receiver one category at some point, but may or may not fit that profile depending on how you look at it and what we can apply here to the rookies going forward or anybody else. So I guess let's just start off with that. What exactly makes a true wide receiver one in the NFL, if we can define that?
Well, I think one thing to get out of the way first is, and you kind of hinted at this, is a guy can be number one on his team's depth chart and, in my opinion, not be a number one receiver in the NFL. Like, just the blanket statement for it is there are not 32 of these players in the National Football League, despite the fact that there are 32 teams in the National Football League. Now, I think it's gotten a little hairy. That was something I believed going into working on reception perception, which I've been doing now since 2013 is really when I started kind of pulling together the kind of basis and the methodology of reception perception. 2014 was the first year that I collected league-wide data, or I shouldn't say league-wide data, but a bunch of players, like filling the historical database. It goes back to 2014. So back then I was generally said, yeah, there's not 32 number one receivers. It's gotten a little hairier since then just because there are so many good receivers in the NFL right now. It feels like the position has gotten deeper and deeper every single year. Every year we're talking about this is a great draft class. These guys are both coming into the league more prepared to be good right away. And I think coaches nowadays are more willing to meet these guys halfway in terms of deployment, in terms of telling them what to do on every snap. There are more roles available now for receivers, right? Like what Cooper Kupp is doing and really has been doing with the LA Rams for years, and again, he came in the league like 2017. That was so unique at the time. Now there are more and more of these like power slot receivers, right? More of these guys are becoming, Amon-Ra St. Brown. I joked that he was Bud Light Cooper Kupp before he got drafted by the Detroit Lions, who had the former Rams quarterback, and Brad Holmes, who worked with the Rams. So there was some connective tissue there. But I say all that to say that it's gotten, I think, like how to define a number one receiver has gotten more difficult just because, maybe 8 years ago, I would have said, can a guy be a number one receiver if he is a slot receiver? Can you really run your offense through a slot receiver? Because back then, a slot receiver was like, Wes Welker or even like Jarvis Landry, right? When he was with the Miami Dolphins, it's like, yeah, he's putting up big numbers, Jarvis Landry. He's putting up high catch totals, but is that a very good offense there in Miami? And same with some of these other teams. And like you look at Wes Welker, yeah, they were great with Wes Welker in New England, but because they had Randy Moss, right? And then when Moss aged out, then they kind of had this two tight end set going on there. So it's like for a while, I feel like if you had that guy as a slot player, high volume, you kind of needed another guy to dictate coverages on the outside and be the true volume funnel there. I think in today's NFL, that's not really the case. And like, let's just talk about the Lions here as a quick example. Like, is Amon-Ra St. Brown a number one receiver in the NFL? Easy yes to me. I think the answer is easy yes. Would have said that pretty much like after his rookie year. I thought he showed the signs that if he was going to play in that power slot role, he had all of the makings from a reception perception standpoint to be that guy. But the Lions don't really have like an outside receiver that's truly emerged just yet. We'll see with Jamison Williams, but I think that is, again, sort of the league has been more open now to more players filling that archetype of the number one receiver, even if they're a little bit different from the receivers that we thought about of old. So that's kind of like a table setter to the discussion here.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of that has to do with scheme? The guys that you kind of mentioned there, Ben Johnson, I mean, I don't know how closely, I'm not a scheme expert, but how closely he's kind of kept to the tree that he's kind of from. But, you mentioned Kupp with McVay. So with the proliferation of those wide zone or at least play action style Shanahan and McVay schemes, do you think that kind of helps a diversity of those wide receivers be more, capable of that? Or?
I think so, and it's interesting too because like we think about that slot receiver being the number one guy. Like these guys, Dan Campbell, and then Ben Johnson worked under Dan Campbell previously. They all kind of come off that, or at least Dan Campbell came from that like New Orleans background where they made a ton of use of like the Marcus Colston as that big slot receiver. Even to the point that when he was drafted, he had like tight end eligibility in fantasy football on Yahoo way back in the day. And like if you drafted Marcus Colston, he was like a total cheat code as a rookie because of that. But because he was sort of in that hybridy like power slot mold way before anybody else was even really doing this. And I think that tree has used it a little bit differently than some of these Shanahan guys have done it. But it is funny too, because again, part of me then pushes back on myself where I would say, to talk about San Francisco specifically, like, who's the number one receiver in San Francisco? Is it Deebo Samuel or is it Brandon Ayuk? I think it's Brandon Ayuk, and I think it's pretty clear, especially now at this point. Just I think with where Deebo is, and after a lot of injuries and stuff like that. Because to me, Zach, I think an offense, and especially this offense, this tree of guys, but really just the 49ers and Kyle Shanahan specifically, we get caught up in like the gadgety, create a touch stuff, like these funky rolls with Deebo, or where's he lining up? Even sort of some of the other players that have come through there. But that offense is at its best when it has a true X receiver that can line up on the line of scrimmage and beat press man coverage and win vertical routes. Right now, that guy's Brandon Ayuk. In previous stops, it's been Julio Jones with the Falcons or Andre Johnson back with the Texans. So that's when the offense hits its peak, and it's like, obviously, a lot of factors have pushed San Francisco to the point they're at now offensively. Brock Purdy emerging, Christian McCaffrey trade. But like, let's not rule out the fact that throughout the course of that time in San Francisco, they didn't have like a true number one X receiver type. I think they do now in Brandon Ayuk.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because if you would have said that Brandon Ayuk's rookie year, people would have laughed at you. Especially with Deebo there now, and it looks like he may not even be on the team come this time next year. In fact, if I was a betting person, I would say that's probably the case. Haven't talked to somebody from San Francisco quite yet on that, but hopefully we'll get to and see what they have to say. But so how many of those guys do you think there really are in the league that are kind of, maybe they're helped by a scheme, but they're scheme independent and they're not really threatened by anybody else coming in? They're somebody who can dominate, like you were talking about. Previously, before Jamar Chase was drafted, people maybe would have thought that T. Higgins was a wide receiver one. We mentioned him. Devontae Smith, kind of similar situation. Jalen Waddle as well. Who are some guys that maybe are genuine wide receiver ones other than the guys that you mentioned, and who's maybe a wide receiver one or previously thought of as a wide receiver one who may or may not be on a team?
So this is a good question, because I've actually started to think about receivers just is like at the top of the league in buckets. And I think there's 3 buckets to place these guys in. There's like the elite number one receivers, which to me is a very, very small group. It's like 6 or 7 guys. It's Justin Jefferson. I think Devontae Adams is still in this group. Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase is definitely in this group. I think CeeDee Lamb graduated into this group last year. I think guys like Stephon Diggs and maybe Cooper Kupp fell out of this group last year. So, but again, that's a very, very small select group. I think the guys that are right there knocking at the door in the next tier, which I would call the superstar number one tier. I think there's a difference between saying a guy's a superstar versus saying he's an elite number one receiver. Those are your again, Ayuk is right there. I thought the Seahawks guys, or Mike Evans is definitely in this tier. But that's also a pretty small group. Amon-Ra St. Brown definitely belongs in that superstar group to me. I think Nico Collins graduated into that group last year just based on his play. I think Garrett Wilson is kind of ready to rock in that tier. I've always been a big Terry McLaurin guy. I think he belongs in that superstar number one tier. Then you get into like the next group of guys, and this sort of transitions into what I really want to talk about here, which is, what do you do with these guys that are what I would have said previously coming into this year, the 1B receivers, he's not a number 2. He's a 1B. Because Zach, B is the second letter of the alphabet.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're really saying there is you're trying to be extra nice, but you're still saying that this guy is a number 2 receiver, like Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins. The list goes on and on. Tyler Lockett. DK Metcalf even like I think at times Lockett's been the one and DK's been the two. That's sort of been like a flip flop situation there. Now I think at this point Lockett is sort of kind of on the back nine of his career, makes it a little trickier. Chris Godwin I think has been this guy at different times for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So that's where I've almost kind of like, in my opinion, in my view at least, like been a little stricter with who is and is not a number one receiver, because like I really need proof of concept. Like I need a season of film of this guy being a one to really say he can be that dude. Like I'm talking about defenses treat you as a one. You're running big boy routes. You're beating press man coverage if you're an outside receiver. If you're a slot receiver, you need to be like an A tier zone beater like an Amon-Ra St. Brown is. Like Cooper Kupp has been before he had his like huge breakthrough, like Deebo Samuel has been at times. So again, it does matter a little bit where they're going to line up in terms of what kind of skills I want to see you have. But that's, I think, the trickiest part to me right now, Zach, is talking about these guys like a T. Higgins, like a Jalen Waddle. Even like Devontae Smith, I think is, if we're talking about the guys that are those number 2, 1B souped up guys, he's probably my favorite. He's probably the highest one that I'd rank there, just if we're stacking talent across the league. And at least we did get his rookie season. Like I thought he was extremely excellent playing as a true X receiver for the Eagles offense. So if I had to bet on one guy being like his team's 2 that could be a 1, it probably would be Smith. But again, it's a tough like proof of concept thing there.
Yeah, with Smith specifically, I'm interested to see how that works out this year, because I own him in a dynasty league, and I've been hoping to get top dollar for him. So I want everybody to go back and listen who's in my league and hear that you said he's the top shelf of that group. So
problem is he'll never be the one there, because AJ Brown is tethered. I mean, maybe at some point Brown starts to decline, but that's where at this point we're squarely in both of these guys' prime, which is tough.
Yeah, they signed them both long-term just recently, earlier this offseason. So with all of that, I kind of want to figure out how else we can apply that, right? So when we look at the rookie class, I've got kind of 2 questions, but they're basically the same. Who from this class this year do you think can be a true number 1? Maybe, I know it's a little bit of a projection, and then who from this class is kind of at risk of not being that main guy next year, and how should those questions impact our draft? I'm thinking mostly of guys, especially with that second part, like Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas, those kind of guys.
So yeah, I think the easy answer there is that all 3 of the top guys, Harrison, Odunze, and Neighbors, that's the order that I rank them in. I think all of them are capable of being true number 1 receivers in the NFL, and true number 1 receivers very early. The Bears situation is going to be interesting, right? Because I think DJ Moore kind of graduated into that superstar receiver tier last year. But man, I love Rome Odunze. Like I think he could be the best receiver on that roster by the end of the year. And like, what does that make the Bears? In terms of who's the 1 there and who's the 2. That's and it's an enviable situation for Caleb Williams, no doubt about that. And they also have Keenan Allen on the roster, who's definitely still performing at a very good number 1 receiver level based on what he did with the Chargers last year. I think the next group of guys is a little more difficult, where I don't know that any of them, outside of maybe Brian Thomas, like I think if I had to bet on one guy developing into a 1, it would probably be Brian Thomas Jr. Beyond him, I don't think that any of them necessarily profile as like easy number 1 receiver projections, because each of them kind of has a not fatal flaw, for sure not a fatal flaw, but like something that puts their ceiling kind of capped a little bit. Even Brian Thomas, like I said, I think he is like, I've said during the draft season that he was the actualized version of what people wanted Quentin Johnston and Christian Watson to be. Like he's that guy that you start him off on this like slow developmental plan, although the Chargers didn't do this at all with Quentin Johnston, which was one of the most baffling things that you possibly could have done, because a whole separate subject. But you kind of start him off on this like volatile receiver where he's running go routes, he's running kind of a limited route tree. You ease him in, and then by year 2, year 3, maybe then you're ready to see those full traits expressed as a number 1 receiver. So he's the one I would say that has the best chance to eventually be that guy. But like Lad McConkey, I think is probably like a souped up 2. I think Xavier Worthy is at his best probably like a number 2. Ricky Pearsall, I was a big Ricky Pearsall fan, but I think he's and obviously crowded depth chart, but like at his best probably a 2. Maybe Adonai Mitchell I think has the traits to be a 1. But I have some concerns just in terms of his ability to be consistent in terms of beating zone coverage. That's going to have to be if he's going to be something beyond just like a great X receiver. Like he can be a great X receiver and never be like a traditional zone beater. But he can dominate against press man. But if he wants to be like a legit 1, I think he's got to get up to a certain point, which we didn't see in college in terms of him beating zone coverage. So, I thought that's why him falling into the second round was kind of a little mystifying. I know there was personality concerns, stuff like that, but he stood out to me as a guy that had like not a clean path to being a number 1, but you can squint at it and see it.
Okay, good information to have. Yeah, the Brian Thomas thing, I think especially is interesting because Trevor Lawrence is at a very key point in his career. Obviously, at this point, probably going to be signing a contract. So if we can get that from Brian Thomas, he'd be feasibly locked in with the guy for a while there.
And I think Jacksonville has the guys around him on the roster to not throw him to the wolves right away, right? Where he's definitely going to be out there, I think, almost every snap, or at least he should be. If he's not, something's gone horribly wrong. Like I know you signed Gabe Davis. Okay, whatever. Like Brian Thomas needs to be out there because he just brings a better, more consistent route runner skill set against press man than Gabe Davis ever will for you at any point. But like you've got a volume hog in Christian Kirk, and you've got like a safety blanket receiver in Evan Ingram. Brian Thomas doesn't have to come out there and carry the passing game load like he might on a different team. So him going to Jacksonville made a lot of sense to me in terms of a good landing spot for him.
Okay. Last thing on him real quick. Do you think, I know last year, Calvin Ridley, he, I think, struggled a little bit with being pressed at the line, and he was the most pressed receiver in the league, I think, or up pretty far up there, if I remember correctly. Is Thomas going to help with that? Do you think that they drafted him partially to help solve those issues, or any thoughts real quick on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I really liked Brian Thomas's ability to beat press. I thought the more you saw of him, the more the season went on, the better he played against press. 73.9% success rate versus press in reception perception, pretty good number. While seeing it at a relatively high volume too, because it's funny, like obviously Malik Neighbors is a better prospect, but Neighbors was the one kind of getting like the slot targets, the schemed up stuff, moved away from harder coverage, and Brian Thomas really had to deal with a lot of that on the outside. And it is funny because I think the thing with Ridley is not just that he was pressed a ton and kind of like the static usage as an X receiver, which by the way, I think Thomas is more equipped than Ridley just from a size, press beating skill set standpoint to be an X receiver, but also the like linear nature of Ridley's route tree. It was a lot of go routes and comebacks and curls. I think Brian Thomas actually fits that a lot better. Like you want Ridley working horizontally. You want him running crossing routes and dig routes and really use that route running. And with Thomas, I think you actually want him rip and go routes. You want him working back to the football. You saw a lot of that in college. Some of his best routes, 82.9% success rate on the curl route. Very good on post routes and 9 routes as well.
Okay. Yeah. So let's dig into a couple of other teams then as well, while we're kind of on the team fit subject here. We are going to have a couple of good offenses, and then I threw in one here that I forgot I didn't tell you about, but you mentioned the Bucs, so we'll ask you about them as well. I want to ask you specifically about the Packers and the Texans, because it seems like in all of those situations we have kind of a glob of wide receivers that I personally don't know how things are going to shake out. For the Packers specifically, I want to know kind of who you would bet on to score the most fantasy points this year. And does that guy that you'd bet on to score the most fantasy points also have the highest upside? If you're looking at, I mean, the 4 guys there, I know Watson, Reed, Wicks, Dobbs, I think would probably be the 4 that we're looking at for the most part. And Reed is being drafted way ahead of Watson right now. So what are your thoughts on the Packers?
Man, yeah, I think the Packers are emblematic of something that I think could be kind of like the way the league is trending, which is if you don't have a true number 1, just get like kind of a lot of guys and sort of take a committee approach to the wide receiver position. I think Kansas City has done this the last few years. Not always to great results, but I really like the way their room sets up this year. It's funny. It's like, oh, you use a first round pick on a guy, he's got to be your future number one receiver. The Bills take Keon Coleman high in the second round, he's got to be their future number one receiver. Maybe, or maybe you have a room where like a lot of guys get, like 4 guys get between 80 to 110 targets, but nobody comes out there at the like 130 plus type of range. Now, I do think the Packers are interesting here because I think they fit into this group where all 4 of those guys there, Reed, Wicks, Watson, and Dobbs, are good to some degree. Like, I think there are, if we wanted to think about it from like a bar graph standpoint, all of them go past a certain threshold where like you can have this guy as one of your top 3 or 4 receivers and feel really good about it. But certain those guys have like higher ceilings, like their bar goes higher on the graph. They all pass, like I said, that certain threshold. But for me, I think the 2 guys I like the best in that room are Reed and Wicks. Like, if you're asking me who's the favorite to score the most fantasy points, I think, and really honestly, who's the favorite to develop into the number 1 there, I think Jaden Reed has to be considered the odds-on favorite just based on the way he played last year. I just posted his reception perception charts and results on my Twitter, and like any way you slice it, he was impressive as a separator last year. He beat man coverage, beat zone coverage. He was very limited looks against press, but he was great against press. Like, he got a lot of these like design touches as sort of the slot receiver, but nothing about his game says he can't line up on the outside and win big boy routes. Now, Dontavian Wicks, on the other hand, I really like Dontavian Wicks. Very impressive in limited looks. He's like, bottom line for people that are new to reception perception, if you're going to be an outside receiver and you clear 70% against man and press coverage, we're interested in you. That's a high upside player. Dontavian Wicks does both as a rookie last year for the Green Bay Packers, and he specifically thrives on these like intermediate routes. And to me, like, if you're going to be an outside receiver and you're going to play in this system, you got to win in the intermediate area. Christian Watson has been inconsistent doing that throughout his first 2 seasons in the NFL. Wicks was very promising as a rookie. So Wicks is kind of like my sneaky favorite to be the number 1 receiver. I think odds-on favorite, though, probably has to be Jaden Reed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Reed caught, I think, 8 touchdowns last year as well. Was pretty good down the stretch. And I'm looking at his profile here on your website, and there are a lot of green routes on this chart that you have here by success by route rather. So yeah, and just as a side note, I really love these charts that you put together because it really just helps visualize exactly. You got all of the article and the breakdown, but the chart really helps you visualize everything you're talking about. So all right, so we got Reed there, and now the Texans specifically, I mentioned those. They brought in Stephon Diggs this year. They already had Nico Collins, which, if anybody was listening to your show in the last 6 to 10 to probably 2 years, I guess.
Pretty much since his rookie year. As James Coe says, said prior to this year, Matt Harmon has a weird affinity for Nico Collins. Well, yeah, James. Weirdly, Nico Collins almost had 1,300 yards this year. So whatever.
Yeah, I think it was somewhere around wide receiver 7. So, and then you've got Tank Dell. The craziness that was Tank Dell last year. What are we going to do with those guys? I'll be honest, I was really nervous about Tank Dell coming into the league just because of the size. I mean, a lot of people were. Maybe that was oversimplified, but I know you just put his profile up and he was a smashing success. So how do we sort out Steph Diggs, Nico Collins, Tank Dell?
Yeah, see, this one I think is even more difficult than the Packers room, because I think the Packers room has a bunch of guys who could be really good 2s. Maybe, like I said, if Wicks develops, I think maybe he could be a 1. Maybe Reed could be like kind of an unconventional number 1 receiver. But like the Texans have 3 guys that I think could be number 1 receivers. And that makes it really difficult because let's start with Stephon Diggs. They add him this past year. Diggs has been like a reception perception guy. Back in his early days with the Vikings, he was like number 1 in the league in success rate versus man and press coverage. Like that is my guy, man. He was a number 1 receiver, an elite number 1 receiver back in Minnesota. You just didn't know it because he didn't get the volume commensurate to a number 1. He goes to Buffalo, everything works out. But last year, again, just to be honest, like the film was the film, and the film wasn't as good. It was acceptable. It was quality film, but there was a pretty significant drop off on vertical routes for Stephon Diggs. Still a good separator short and underneath. But not as much from a downfield standpoint. Like he drops from, like the 98th, 99th percentile against man coverage down to like the 70th, which again, if you're starting receiver in the NFL, like 70th percentile is good. It's just Stephon Diggs is not a normal NFL receiver. So I think it's just like, where is Diggs at this point in his career is interesting to talk about. I think he is probably a guy that you want running more of those short and underneath routes at this point. So maybe he ends up being their primary slot receiver. Cause like Tank Dell, you think coming into the league, oh, he's going to be a slot guy because of the size. Right. Not so fast. Like in his reception perception sample, he was outside on 75.8% of his sampled snap. And he was kind of between like on the line and off the line. And he's able to do this because despite that size, he can beat man coverage, 74th percentile success rate versus man. And he wins on like big boy routes, like over 80% success rate on comebacks, outs, and corners. Like it's not hyperbole to say that like he was one of the best receivers on outbreaking routes as a rookie. And then you look at bringing it to Nico Collins here, the weird affinity. Nico Collins, again, he was good in reception perception, like viewing in isolation. He was good his first 2 seasons, especially that second season. It all comes together last year, and he took even another step, Zach. Like Nico Collins, from a reception perception standpoint, clears the 90th percentile against man and press coverage last year. Like I think he is the answer in terms of who is the odds-on favorite to be the one and has the highest upside. The answer is Nico Collins to both questions, but it's just like, how are all 3 of these guys getting fed? Because that was mostly a positive review for all 3 of these guys. Obviously with Tank Dell, it's just he's coming back from an injury. How much volume are you giving a guy like that? Coming like we can all do this. Like, oh, cool, Tank Dell's working out. He's back. Well, Tony Pollard said he was back, right? And then he told me at the Super Bowl he didn't feel like himself until week 11. So, we can't just like yada these things. But, yeah, I don't know. Again, kind of a long-winded answer there, but I think they're very emblematic of a unique situation where I don't think it can be wide receiver by committee because all 3 of these guys are excellent players. But Nico is probably my favorite of the group right now.
No, Matt, that's really interesting. And I think that, yeah, it's good that you bring up the injury stuff with Tank Dell because that we'll have to see how that plays out maybe through training camp and things up here in the future. You might not see a ton with OTAs as to how that's going to work out, but yeah, okay. So Nico Collins, if you're going to bet on somebody there, bet on that guy, according to Matt. So I'll ask you this just really, really quick because I frankly don't not know a lot about Jalen McMillan yet. But the Buccaneers, they drafted him, I think it was in the 3rd. You've got Mike Evans and then Chris Godwin. And I think you just tweeted a video recently about defending Chris Godwin. So in like 2 seconds, like what about the Bucs?
Bucs are interesting because, all the talk, and again, I'm sure you guys have covered this extensively, that like he's moving back into the slot right under this new coaching staff, which I think makes sense for Chris Godwin. He's a guy that, like Todd Bowles said, can win outside. He can play outside, but he works better as that big slot receiver. Like he's really doing. It's funny because he was like doing Cooper Kupp big slot receiver things. Like I used to say that if he got plopped into that Cooper Kupp role in the Rams offense, like he could probably produce the same numbers as Cooper Kupp. Well, now he's getting plopped into Liam Cohen's offense, who, he was there for some of the seasons, not the nuclear Cooper Kupp season, but regardless, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I do think Chris Godwin, like, is a very forgotten about player. Was productive last year, just didn't score touchdowns. And prior to that knee injury, man, I think he was like knocking on the door of being one of the best receivers in the league. I've always been a huge Chris Godwin fan. The Jalen McMillan thing is interesting because, yeah, they're moving Chris Godwin back into the slot, but Jalen McMillan was kind of a pure slot in college, is almost exclusively where he lined up. But what is interesting, Zach, is that if you look at his reception perception data, he actually performed better, did Jalen McMillan, against man coverage than zone coverage. And typically, if you're going to be a slot receiver, you're going to want to be better against zone coverage and man coverage. So maybe he can do a little bit of like flanker stuff, but either way, like, whoever the third receiver is on this offense, I don't think is going to get a ton of looks. To me, it's going to mostly funnel through Mike Evans, and then I think Chris Godwin's going to have a bigger impact this year if he's healthy than people think.
Yeah, and I think he's on a contract here as well, so he's going to need to perform if he hopes to get paid, either staying with that team or moving on to somewhere else. All right. I know you said you had a chicken on the smoker here, so I want to be quick with these, but everyone wants to know the next Puka Nacua. I mean, we get that question, and of course, we want to identify that as well. But what I really want to know is who's the next Quentin Johnston, because it's great to get a guy late that overperforms. That's amazing. But it really hurts to draft a guy high in your either dynasty rookie drafts or maybe taking a shot in a regular fantasy league when you draft a guy that you're hoping, should turn into something. So who's this year's Quentin Johnston, if there is one?
I think it's worth noting with Quentin Johnston, who, if you've seen the reception perception profile on Quentin Johnston from his rookie year, it's about as bad as it can possibly be.
Lots of red.
Lots of red, a lot of first percentiles, which is not what you're looking for. The thing with Quentin Johnston, though, is that he was set up to fail, man. Like, I mean, he was set up to fail, but also didn't earn like role catering as a rookie because he just wasn't performing at all when viewed in isolation. But nothing, Zach, and I mean nothing. Like there's nothing from his TCU film that told you he could go out there and win as an X receiver day one in the NFL and win on big boy routes against press man coverage. 0.0 things. There were good things on his film. Nothing that would have pointed you to that. But that is exactly, for whatever reason, the Chargers asked him to do as a rookie. I know it's like, oh, well, we didn't want him. We wanted him to develop behind Mike Williams. Well, first of all, you're a win now team. And second of all, Mike Williams gets hurt. It happens. It happens. That's the universe we lived in. So I think for a guy to be the next Quentin Johnston, he has to be sort of a raw, kind of unprepared prospect, and he has to be put in an ill-fitting role. I think the two guys that are worth highlighting there are Keon Coleman with the Buffalo Bills and Xavier Legette. And look, I hate saying anything negative about these two guys because they're like electric in press conferences and they seem like wonderful humans. So I hope that they work out. I hope they're not Quentin Johnston. Shoot, I hope Quentin Johnston develops down the Devontae Adams path and crushes it in his future seasons. I don't want any of these guys to fail, but with Keon, I think he is best suited to play inside. I know the Bills are saying right now, oh, he's our X receiver. I wonder if they don't get to camp and say like, okay, we need to move him around a little bit more. So he's a guy that I would worry is going to get miscast. And then Xavier Legette, I think, is even more of like a guy that needs true role catering. He cannot go out there and play X receiver in his rookie season. He has some skills. He can beat zone coverage. He's a load to bring down in the open field. He can run some crossing routes pretty well. But like the rest of the route tree is still a work in progress. He's a very raw player. So the good news is I think the Panthers have a sense of that. Like you hear Dave Canales talk about, we want to use him in routes on the move. We want to move him all over the field. And like they have Deontay Johnson who can handle the traditional duties of a number one outside receiver. So I think that's a good thing for him, but those are the two guys I'd be like keeping my ear to the ground in terms of like, where's he lining up in camp? How is he being used early on in his rookie season? Because that was the thing with Quentin Johnston. Like you could see it from game one when, after Mike Williams got hurt and like they had to start counting on him to play a lot of snaps, he was playing in this role that just was never going to work for him. And like, it never really got better at any point during his rookie season.
Gotcha. So that situation and the fit and the talent there matter a lot. And that's be interesting to see. Kellen Moore was the guy running that Chargers offense last year. Now he's with the Eagles. So I'll be interested to see how that works out. So Coleman and Legette, who is this year's JSN? Maybe it's a guy we're excited about, but maybe they kind of get squeezed out by the guys that are already there.
I think obviously Odunze is the easy answer just because they have two like high quality, again, guys that performed at number one receiver, superstar receiver level last year. But man, I love Odunze much more than I like JSN, but I loved Odunze even more as a prospect. And he doesn't fit into like the slot receiver role. So that's kind of a tough one. He'd be the like odds-on favorite to be that answer. But I also think it's worth saying that like Brian Thomas, who we talked about earlier, would be that guy too, just because he could. I think he's probably gonna have more of a DK Metcalf rookie year where they ramp him up a little bit slowly. They feed a lot of volume to the established players on the roster. And then the obvious answer is Ricky Pearsall, where I think Ricky Pearsall will be ready to make a day one impact for the San Francisco 49ers. I don't think they're going to need him to make a day one impact just because they have so many good players there already.
Yeah. And they've got, and that's only not if you're looking at the wide receivers, but then you've got the running back and tight end situation as well for them. So, okay, last question, and I'll get you out of here to your smoked chicken. As we get through OTAs and through into training camp, are there any particular position battles, rookie specific or otherwise, that you are watching?
I mean, obviously, I'd want some clues on these receiver situations we've highlighted here. The Bears, the Texans, the Packers, who's taking starter snaps here. That's definitely one. But to me, it's more so just tracking the drumbeat on some of these guys like Rashad Bateman or Jamison Williams, these guys who have maybe Jahan Dotson, same thing, these guys who have been unproductive to start their seasons, sort of based on expectations, but the team still seems to be very much counting on them to be starting outside guys. So those are the players I'm really watching this year is how are this coaching staff talking about them? How are they viewing them as players? Are they executing out there? Because that's going to be critical to maybe getting some value in fantasy drafts.
Yeah, and Bateman just got that extension as well. So thanks, hey, again, for joining me. Remind us real quick where everybody can find what you do.
Yeah, you can find me on social media at @Harmon_BYB. You mentioned the podcast up at the top. Both of them I host. A lot of talking, man. Always talking. But the big thing, receptionperception.com. If you like any of this wide receiver information I've dropped today, you're going to love receptionperception.com. Currently, like I said, just dropped the year 2 wide receivers. I'm currently working on the year 3 to 4 wide receivers. So that's a fun group. Just finished Nico Collins the other day, working on Jahan Dotson, Jamison Williams. A lot of interesting players coming up in that drop as well.
Yeah, the stuff that you do is genuinely one of the biggest things I think people need to have in their toolbox if you're a fantasy player or not, if you're just a general NFL wide receiver fan. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Remember to check Matt out at receptionperception.com, as he mentioned, as well as those podcasts. Don't forget to check out our website as well. Use that code podcast for 50% off at 32beatwriters.com. We've been getting a lot of those signups, and make sure you are not one of those who are left out. For Matt Harmon, I'm Zach Haidu. And we'll see you guys next time.